finding in our diagram that that corresponded to 8,700, or a stock price of $87, we could determine that the break-even point would be for that position. Now, there are other ways to use options as hedges besides that example that we looked at here. For instance, let's take a look at this case. Now, here an investor believes that ABC is overvalued and has sold short 100 shares of stock. Now, briefly, remember what that means. This investor has borrowed 100 shares of stock, hoping that the stock will fall and produce a profit for the investor when the stock drops. But takeover rumors have been circulating about ABC, and so the stock could rise. Now, that is when a short seller is going to have some trouble. They could have large losses as the stock goes up. So what option position would protect an investor against a rise in the price of ABC stock? Now again, notice in this case, we want protection against a rise in the price of the stock because we're trying to hedge a short position. In a short stock position, the investor is hoping that the stock will fall. If the stock falls, since the investor has sold borrowed stock, the stock falls and the investor makes a profit. So as the stock drops, this would result in a profit to the investor. However, the danger is if the stock rises. If the stock does rise, then the investor will have to pay more, sometimes much more, for the borrowed stock to replace it than was originally received. So this can result in a large loss to the short seller. Theoretically, it's unlimited. So this seems like a good time to use a hedge. Now, what we need, though, is an option position that would be profitable if the stock rises. So we hope that the profit we earn on the hedge will offset some of the loss we have on the short stock position if the stock goes up. So how do we find out what to use here as a hedge? Now, recall that in our option diagram, the two positions that might work that would produce a profit as the stock goes up would be a long call and a short put. So there are two possibilities that we could use here. But again, one of them works better for us, has more flexibility, and that is the long call. Remember that with a long call, you own the option and you decide when to use the option. So you have more control in this situation, and it will work better for us as a hedge. So we're going to take a look at an example here of what to do. Now, to see how a long call could act as a hedge, let's take the short stock position that we have here in our example. We shorted the stock at 113, and the investor, after doing that, looks for protection against rising stock prices by buying an ABC February 115 call at 8. We'll assume that this is the position that they'd want. Now, a paid and received diagram, again, can be real helpful because it can help us visualize what's going on. Notice our first entry for this short sale will be on the received side because when you short stock, you borrow stock and sell the borrowed stock. So since the investor is selling the borrowed stock, then that entry would go on the received side. $11,300 was going to be sold as stock at 113. Now we've also purchased the call, but since we bought the call, that premium is entered on the paid side of that diagram. Now, that's a cost to us. The critical question for the short seller is, how much will we have to pay to replace the stock that we borrowed? Because you'll have to do that at some point. You borrowed stock and sold it, and now you're going to have to give it back. You're going to have to buy it back to give it back. What are you going to have to pay eventually? Now, of course, the danger to the short seller is rising stock prices. For example, suppose that the stock rose to $150 per share. We would have a real problem then if we just had a plain short sale. We'd have to replace the stock at $150, but you'd only sold it for $113, so a large loss would be incurred. But the investor, remember, owns a call. What is that? It represents the right to buy stock at $115 per share, the strike price, on demand. So the short seller will never have to pay more than $11,500 to replace the stock. So at worst, the investor will pay $12,300, $11,500 for the stock plus $800 for the option, against $11,300 received. So the maximum possible loss would be $1,000. Now, that may seem like a large amount, but look at what you could have as a loss. In this case, we have $3,700 potential loss, and there is no limit to what it could be. So if this is your maximum loss, at least you put a ceiling on how bad things could get. Of course, this investor hopes to make money as the stock falls. What would be the best possible outcome for the short seller? Well, the stock goes to zero. Now, that's what the investor is hoping for. If the stock goes to zero, then the investor would pay virtually nothing to replace the borrowed shares. However, the call option, like an unused insurance policy, expires worthless And you can see that because the stock is at 0 and the call is at 115, so it's way out of the money and therefore worthless. So what we would have is that the investor would pay $800 for the option, and if the stock goes to 0, they would receive $11,300 from the short stock position for an overall net profit of $10,500. That's your best possible outcome in this scenario. Now, another question that you might be asked about this particular position is, what is the break-even point? Now, we know that on a short sale, the investor wants the stock to fall. Ordinarily, this investor would make money if the stock fell below 113 because that's the price that the original short sale occurred. But remember that this investor also paid $800 for the call. That's the insurance policy cost, and we need to recover that cost. Therefore, the investor must make $800 on the short sale just to offset the cost of the call. So the stock would have to fall to 105 for the investor to break even. Now, to show that 105 is the break even, assume that the stock goes to 105 and we close out our short sale at that time. Now, what would the T-chart show if we chose to do this? Well, we'd replace the borrowed stock by buying it back for 105 per share in the market, $10,500. The call would be out of the money and it would expire worthless. Remember that the stock is at 105 and it's a 115 call, so the call isn't worth anything. So the total amount paid would equal the total amount received, and the investor will have broken even at 105. Well, that wraps up our discussion on fundamentals of options. I hope you'll join me for the rest of the Series 7 programs. And remember to contact your local STC branch for help. If you'd like additional materials, call 1-800-STC-1223. And thank you from Securities Training Corporation.